For today's video we're going to take a look at a Nikkor 50mm f2 lens made somewhere around 1968. This fairly early version of the lens doesn't show the Nikon name, but rather the Nippon Kojaku optical company name. It was Nippon Kojaku who formed the Nikon brand sometime after the Second World War. This particular lens is in very used condition and has a number of issues to look at before it's ready to be used. The filter thread is damaged in two places. Someone has obviously tried repairing this with a pair of pliers because you can see the marks on the outside. The grease in the focusing helicoid threads has partially dried out, making the focus ring a bit loose and not as smooth as you'd expect. But somewhat more serious is the damage to the rear end. It looks like the lens has been dropped on tarmac with the lens cap off. There are a number of scratches and scuffs, with one particularly large mark right in the middle of the lens. I'm not sure how successfully, if at all, these can be fixed, but it'll be interesting finding out anyway. For the repair to the filter thread I'm going to use a lens vise. It has two different sizes of former which can be expanded outwards using the screw on the end. The former parts have the correct pitch of thread to match the filter thread, although the thread isn't very well formed on my particular example. I've not used the lens vise before, but I've seen videos of people using them. The method I've seen involves expanding the lens vise to the size of the filter thread and then rotating it round to the dented section to push the dent out. This method may work in some cases, but it does involve putting a lot of twisting force on the front bezel, and it could also mash up the threads if you don't get it just right. I found it easier to simply use the lens vise as a spreader, inserting it in line with the dented section and opening it out using the screw, being careful not to go too far and actually distort the good side of the lens. Anyway, that's now looking quite good, so I'll try it out with a screw-on lens hood. And that's gone on fine, so I think we can call that part of the job done. I guess it's now time to tackle the big job and look at the rear element. There's absolutely no guarantee that this will work, and if you're planning to try this, stick around to the end of the video before you attempt it yourself. To get the lens apart, I'll be needing my lens wrench to remove the lock rings that hold the glass elements in place. I've got the lens wrench set to the right size to remove the rear element lock ring. And it looks like the whole housing is coming out rather than just the lock ring. And right now it's loose. I'll unscrew it the rest of the way using my fingers. I'm not too worried about fingerprints on the glass at this stage because I'll be working on the glass in a minute anyway. To try to remove the inner lock ring, I'll place the housing on a rubber mat to create friction and use the lens wrench. And straight away I can feel that the lock ring on the back is unscrewing, so I'll remove that and try again. And still it won't move. Generally, parts of a lens shouldn't be excessively tight. Sometimes there can be a tiny grub screw securing things, and also some manufacturers use a lacquer of some kind to stop parts rattling loose. I'll have a closer look using a magnifying glass. And there's no signs of lacquer, so it may be that my rubber mat isn't giving me enough friction. So I'll go away and make myself a lens spanner to grip the housing. Back in a minute. Okay, I've made myself a lens spanner. This is just cut from a sheet of steel. I've used a stepper drill to drill the hole and then cut and shape the rest using a hacksaw and file. This should allow me to grip the outside of the housing while I try to undo the lock ring. And sorry for my hand blocking the view from the camera. And yep, it still won't budge, so there must be something sticking it in place. Right, I've made a little progress. I've placed drops of alcohol onto the thread in the hopes that it will seep down and soften whatever compound has been used as an anti-rattle solution. And we've got a little more movement. I'll add a bit more alcohol and then try again. I'm using a small screwdriver to transport the drops of alcohol onto the thread because I don't want it going everywhere. The lock ring is now loose enough that I can move it the rest of the way just using the blade of the screwdriver. And finally the rear element is out, after putting up quite a bit of a struggle. I've got two possible methods for polishing the glass. One is to use a leather strop block with a fine cutting compound. I know this works for polishing glass, and it has the advantage that I can rock the lens as I polish it to try to keep the polishing action even across the glass. My backup solution is to use a polishing mop on a Dremel. Neither solution is perfect. The glass in a lens is precision ground, and any amount of tampering will affect the way that the light passes through the lens. Additionally, any traces of coating on the lens will be removed during the process, making it more susceptible to lens flare. Before I do anything, I'm going to tape over the back of the lens because I don't want any polish touching that surface. I can remove the tape and clean off any glue residue once I've finished. And my polish of choice is Peak polish. This is actually a very fine metal polish, but it also works quite well as a glass polish. And it'll be fine for proving whether this level of lens damage can be polished out or not. So I'll spread out some polish ready to get started. So here goes. I'll gently rock the lens as I polish it, and also keep rotating it to try to avoid creating any flat spots. I'll keep on with this process, frequently stopping to examine the progress as I go along. Having started the polishing, the extent of the damage is more evident. It isn't just surface scuffs and scratches, there are actual chips missing. These are unlikely to come out well. Even if they are polished to the extent that they aren't so visible to the eye, there will still be a polished crater which will make the light ping off in all sorts of directions. Anyway, that's about as much as I can do without the correct equipment to properly grind a lens from fresh glass. So I'll just buff off the polish and then we can get on with cleaning the rest of the optics. For cleaning the glass elements, I use washing up liquid and warm water, making sure my hands are free of any grit before I begin. Once cleaned, I'll dab the lens dry with a good quality kitchen roll. There's a little bit of haze in the front group of elements, so I'll clean those while I'm at it. First of all, the front bezel needs to come off. There's a tiny screw at the top of the lens that needs to come out before you can unscrew the bezel. Once the screw is released, I'll flip the lens over onto the rubber mat and rotate the body of the lens anti-clockwise to free off the thread. Once free, I can undo it the rest of the way by hand. Next, the front lens housing needs to come out. This can be freed by using the lens wrench in the two slots, and then it can simply be unscrewed. With the front housing out, the back retaining ring looks like it had some of the anti-rattle lacquer applied, but it didn't stick because I can easily unscrew it using my fingers. Remember to take note of the orientation of each glass element as you dismantle the lens, otherwise it can be a bit of a guessing game for reassembly. This lens is actually pretty simple compared to some of the other lenses I've worked on. And now we can turn our attention to the front element. This time the retaining ring is stuck in place, so I'm dripping some alcohol onto the threads before undoing it. You can buy proper friction tools for undoing this kind of retaining ring, but I usually improvise. On this occasion I've got a disc of rubber and stuck it to a socket. It's important to use something hollow like a socket because you don't want it coming into contact with the curved front of the lens. And then it's just a case of carefully unscrewing the retaining ring using the friction tool. And that's the final glass element out and ready for cleaning. Before reassembly, I'll give each glass element a final buff with a clean lens cloth, and then they're ready to go back into their housing. So now we can turn our attention to the focusing mechanism. I've got the lens set to the infinity position, and I'll mark any parts as I take them off to ensure they go back correctly. The focusing ring on this lens is held on with 3 screws, so I'll just remove these before carefully lifting off the ring. There's already an alignment mark scratched on the inner ring, so I don't need to add a mark myself. If I now extend the lens to reveal part of the helicoid, I can try a trick that more often than not works fine. The only issue with the focusing mechanism on this lens is that the grease has slightly dried out, making the focusing ring a bit loose. I've found that adding a few small drops of oil to the helicoid can reactivate the grease, so I'll just work the focusing mechanism backwards and forwards for a couple of minutes, and hopefully that'll do the trick. It's already feeling much better, so I'll add a couple more drops to the inner thread and work it for a little bit longer. And now that's feeling great, so I think we can call that job done and get on with reassembling the lens. So I've reset the inner focusing ring to the infinity mark, and I can now reattach the outer ring using the 3 screws, making sure it's in the correct orientation. I'll give the lens body a quick blowout to remove any dust or fibres before reinserting the optics. The front housing screws in and then just needs to be nipped up using the lens wrench. You don't want to over tighten anything on a lens, just do it enough so it doesn't come loose. Now the rear optic can be screwed back in, again locking it in place with the lens wrench. And finally the front bezel can go back on, using the rubber mat to tighten it before gently screwing in the grub screw. Be very careful not to over tighten or break this screw, because you'd be in a spot of bother if you broke it. At this point in the video you're probably expecting the amazing reveal shots with examples of how much better the lens is. Well, the filter thread is definitely better, and the focusing ring is now working perfectly, and the optics are nice and clean, but the rear element isn't so good. While it is sometimes possible to polish out light scratches on a lens, it's very much a one-way process, and there's no going back if you're not happy with the results. Often small scratches and marks don't affect the image that badly at all, particularly on the wider apertures. This lens was difficult to focus before due to the large amount of damage on the rear element, but now it's utterly horrendous. If you look at this cropped test shot taken at f2 before polishing the rear element, it's not too bad. There are patches where the text is a bit blurred, but it would still be usable. If we now look at another shot taken at f5.6, it's mostly sharp, but there's some blurring in the top left corner where it's obviously passing through one of the scratches on the rear element. Now if we look at some similar shots taken after polishing the rear element, the orientation of the bad areas will have changed because I won't necessarily have put the element in exactly the same way round. But the image is generally softer and very patchy on this f2 shot. And at f5.6, nothing in the image is particularly sharp, and there's a huge amount of blur in the top left-hand corner. You can of course still use the lens to take photos. It gives some pretty strange and wild bokeh, which might even produce some amazing shots in the right conditions. But you could probably achieve a similar effect by putting a scratched filter on the front of the lens. The benefit of this would be that you could remove the filter and use the lens as a normal lens. So, as I edit this video, would I recommend DIY scratch removal on a lens? The answer to this is definitely not. There are circumstances where it might help, but it's worth doing a load of test shots at all apertures and under different lighting conditions to see exactly how badly your scratch affects the shots before doing anything. You might be surprised at how little effect it actually has. This isn't the end of the story for this lens though, because I've managed to track down a replacement rear element, and assuming it turns up, I'll do another video soon to test how good this lens actually is, and whether it's been worth all the effort. Anyway, that's about all for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. There'll be more tedious and boring stuff coming soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.